Benham and to the New Mexico Humanities Council, and especially Keelan Byram for helping with all of these over the years. And thank you, Paul, for having me. I did just want to say a couple of things about the humanities.
And Jeff, excuse me, is the mic working? Can you?
Touch it.
Is it?
No.
Yeah,
No.
can you come in a little closer to it? Maybe, is that,
Well,
try it. That's it?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's a little better.
Okay.
Yep.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about the Endowment for the Humanities. So it was the National Endowment for the Humanities was created through an act of Congress on the signature of President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. It and the National Endowment for the Arts were born alongside one another as separate and independent agencies, funded solely at the discretion of Congress, which I just mentioned, given how it's been shut down. The sponsor of the bill, Senator Claiborne Pell, spoke of it as the first time in our history that a president of the United States has given his administration support to such a comprehensive measure which combines the two areas most significant to our nation's cultural advancement and to the full growth of a truly great society. And one thing that I found interesting was that Glenn Seaborg, who was the head of the Atomic Energy Commission at the time, actually battled for this with Congress. And he said, we cannot afford to drift physically, morally, or aesthetically in a world in which the current moves so rapidly, perhaps toward an abyss. Science and technology are providing us with the means to travel swiftly. What course do we take? This is the question that no computer can answer. So today's talk was created originally for a program called United We Stand, which looked at activism through a broad variety of lenses. And the lens that I use is comics. So, welcome to Truth, Justice, and the American.
Yay.
The way this is going to work is that we're going to go through the entire history of comics 4 times. So we're taking some broad strokes here. The first time we go through, we're going to look at the stories being told in the comics. Second time through, we're going to look at the creators and the issues that they were dealing with. Third time through, we're going to look at the industry as a whole. And lastly, we're going to take a look at times when comics have stepped beyond the comics realm to directly affect national and global culture. So there's 3 things I want you to, there we go. 3 things I want you to stick in the back of your head as we go through all of this. 3 things about activism. First is 1 step forward, 2 steps back, or any variant on that. That's how activism works. Things take time with activism and pretty much with comics as well. You pretty much have to use the long view. And the third is to remember that activism is a conversation. It may be people marching, it may be hunger strikes or self-immolation or any number of things. But those are important, but they're most important because they generate the discussion afterwards. And that's where things can actually change. So since we're looking at all of this broadly, we're gonna go through things very quickly. And we're not necessarily going to be talking about things that sound quite like they're about activism. But we're going to be looking at the roots of activism along the way, and how it becomes something more than just being a little grumpy about something. So, we're going to start by going back to 1938 with, and that's what we're talking about. So going back to 1938 and Action Comics #1, which is the first appearance of Superman and the first superhero ever in comics. So woohoo!
Yeah, right.
Why are they here? We don't have supervillains yet. Why do we need superheroes? Well, let's take a look at what happens in this first story of Superman. This is his first 12 pages. And this is just a little bit of what he does in those 12 pages. He stops a wife beater. He wakes up the governor in the middle of the night to stop a wrongful execution. He listens in on the senator who's not quite all above board. And many other things he does in those 12 pages. But these are things that you don't necessarily need a super person to do. They are something where it's helpful, you know, it's nice to have somebody who can hang onto the top of a skyscraper, but you don't need that to find out things that are going on. There's other ways to do that. So Superman is there for the common person, and he's sort of beginning his hero's journey. Does anybody know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the hero's journey? No? Yes? So I guess, would you like to tell us about the hero's journey?
No, you tell.
So basically, the hero's journey was espoused by Joseph Campbell, and there are many different versions of it, but it's sort of the epic story that is more or less consistent throughout cultures all around the world. And it starts with someone who is feeling out of place, usually in their world. Like Superman, he's an alien. He just came here. So, and then there's several things that happen, but the important stuff is there's a call to action and a mentor who comes in, and then a bunch of small issues that they must deal with and that they have to learn from. Much like the three things I just showed you with Superman. And then eventually you come back around to a final conflict, having learned things through all of the battles, and you win the final conflict which takes you back to where you began. But you are back where you began, having learned and changed, sometimes having actually died and come back to life, which happens all the time in comics. And so this is sort of a basic hero's journey, and a lot of comics kind of play with certain parts of it. But this was 1938 when Superman appeared, and Captain America, like many of the comics that immediately popped up, within a couple of years, there were something like 500 superhero titles. And most of them were fighting the war. They started out just sort of hinting at it, and very quickly went to things like this. where Captain America is punching out Hitler. In fact, he could take on all the Nazis all by himself, and the Japanese too while he's at it. So these are stories that are not so much the hero's journey as they are wish fulfillment. And so that's what most of the comics were doing. They were fighting the war. But there was one superhero that was not doing the same kind of thing, and that's Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was fighting the war, still fighting crime and fighting problems in our daily world. But she was doing it not by shooting people, but by using the power of truth, love, and compassion. She was created by someone who was a child psychologist working for DC Comics, and this was his take on how best to fight. And here she is with Steve Trevor, her boyfriend.
Okay.
And so here she is. Here she's talking with Steve, and Steve is right with her. He's like, yes, all right, that sounds great, honey. And pointedly, it happens in that order, unlike any other woman in comics. And Steve respects that. Okay, what you're doing as your career, that comes first. So from there into the 1950s now, war's over. Most comics have stopped doing any war comic. Most comics publishers have stopped doing any war comics, and they've also stopped doing superheroes. The superheroes after the war, they had been fighting the war, and they just lost interest in them. So at its low point in the 50s, there were only 5 superhero titles being published. And you got your Archies, and you got romance comics and that kind of thing, but you also got these, and this is EC Comics, as opposed to DC, and so we've got 3 publishers that we're really looking at throughout this talk, and that's DC and Marvel, which we looked at Captain America, he's a Marvel character, and EC, which only existed in the 50s. But it was the top of the line for the artists and writers. People like Ray Bradbury were writing for them, and artists who now, the artwork from these can go for over $1 million. So EC had 4 main tropes, and the way that their comics worked was that just about every comic was 4 short stories in every issue, and they were completely independent. And we're going to look first at the shock suspense stories and the trope that had. Shock suspense stories was their line of comics that were talking about the world as they actually believed it was. Most of what they were publishing were the horror comics, and they had a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and that kind of thing. But shock suspense was about the way the world actually was in their view. And so you got stories like this about this white woman who the KKK kills for consorting with a black man. There's a newspaper reporter who sees it happen, and they catch him. The KKK chases him down, catches him, beats him up, sends him to the hospital. He wakes up a few days later from a coma, and the FBI comes in and they say, hey, can you ID anybody? And he said, yes, I can tell you who the wizard is, the Grand Wizard. And they pull out their guns and they shoot him dead. Because they're not actually the FBI, they are KKK members in disguise as the FBI. And at the end here, the Grand Wizard says, great, we're safe. And then the narrator says, yes, safe behind their masks of prejudice. These hooded peddlers of racial, religious, and political hatred operate today. How long can we stay cool and indifferent to this threat to our democratic way of life? Doesn't sound too different from things we hear today. And this, by the way, is pretty gutsy.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't call them the KKK. They didn't use that name because it was still a federally recognized organization. And it's pretty dangerous. So into the 60s, and Marvel has decided to start trying superheroes again. And they're also kind of playing around more with the hero's journey. So you got things that kind of help with putting together a hero's journey, which is like Thor's mythos. You got a whole mythos there to work with, which is very helpful. Captain America is he's fighting wars all through the 200 years for the bicentennial, and plus some extra years into the future. And Spider-Man, his friend Gwen dies. Now Gwen is not a super character. She has no special abilities. She's just been his friend and at times girlfriend over the last decade in the comics. And when they killed her, she died because physics worked. The laws of physics actually matter if you're just an ordinary person in Marvel Comics. And what happened here was one of the villains threw her off a bridge, and Spidey shot a web out and caught her, but it yanked her back so hard it broke her neck. And this is really powerful stuff. This is not your normal your normal comic. So what they were trying to do with all these things was to make the reader more involved. These were all different ways of getting your reader more involved. And things like this happening really made a difference, because they were no longer telling independent stories where somebody might get beat up one day and then the next story you don't even mention it. But no, they decided to go with continuity in their stories. So once Gwen was dead, Gwen was dead. And that brought a lot of people into feeling more attached to the characters, caring more. And the X-Men was one group of characters where you could really do some other things with that, because they were a group of misfits, basically, people who didn't fit into society, right? And it took them a little while to figure out that they could really use that. And this is into the 60s and 70s, and the counterculture. And it's a good way to to address the issues that the counterculture was dealing with. And just culture in general. And so here is a typical story from this era, and if this doesn't, I'm gonna try playing this. I don't think it's gonna play.
In the Marvel universe, mutants are born with an extra gene within their chromosomal makeup, which manifests in whatever different ways. They're born with it. It often manifests in puberty or adolescence. Mutants are hated and feared throughout the world because of what they're born with, which makes them different. Kitty Pryde, who's a teenager but an X-Man, she's at a party with the new mutants, the younger class, and there's some kid at a neighboring school who's there, and they hit it off. They start to like each other. He has a secret, which is that he is a mutant. His power was that he can create these like crystal light sculptures, but someone has found out that he's a mutant and is like harassing him and threatening him for it, and he winds up killing himself. The second half of the story is like these kids waking up the next day and getting word from their headmaster, and eventually Kitty Pryde delivers the eulogy for this kid. She's talking about herself and the words that are used to describe her, as like a nerdy, flat-chested Jewish mutant. But then she also rattles off a bunch of racial epithets and homophobic slurs, and basically directly runs a correlation between the modes in which words turn into action and the relationship between thought and violence and words and action. And it's like an angry, bitter, sad end of the story.
And that's the kind of stories that they were starting to tell, which was basically a call to activism. And so that was a new thing for the mainstream comics. Not too long before that, underground comics had started up. Underground comics were comics that were done for your average hippie, basically. And they were also done to educate the public about different social issues. So Slow Death Comics, Slow Death Funnies, was one of the first underground comics, and it was done for an ecological center that said they would hand that out to their patrons. And so it's just looks like a Godzilla film or something. but it's actually full of real information about ecology. And you got a bunch of different issues being talked about, and these comics are being sold in head shops primarily, and they're aimed at adults. But you had issues about feminism, drug culture, police brutality, but you're also getting that with the Flying Burrito Brothers. So it's sort of a mix of things there. And probably what became the most important stories that they were telling, were the memoirs, which have evolved since that time to become something very powerful in just regular book publishing now. So these aren't, The American Splendor was an underground comic. Mouse was serialized as an underground comic. Persepolis was done just as a straight graphic novel, and it just got printed as one big story. Mouse is the only comic to have won a Pulitzer. It's about Art Spiegelman, the guy who created it, did the story of his father's time in the concentration camps in World War II. And it shows him also interviewing his dad for all of that information. And learning about all of the weird quirks that his dad had and why he did them and how that related back to the camps. And it's all done as a comic where there's, the cats are Nazis, the Jews are mice, and Polish people are pigs. You know, it's just looks like a comic, but very serious stories there. And because they're memoirs and they're real, that gives it even that much more oomph. So, what was it about all of these things that we've talked about so far that sort of coalesced together in the form of one angry duck? Trapped in a world he never made. Well, to answer that, we have to go back again to the beginning. And this time we're going to go blow right past 1938, all the way back to 1933 with Famous Funnies, which is the very first comic book. Up till this time, comic strips had existed in the newspaper, but they had never existed in the comic book form. And it happened because there was this guy, the ironically named Max Gaines, who worked for a newspaper publisher, and one day he went to his boss and said, hey, you know, we've got all these comic strips we've been publishing for decades. Why don't we just take them, print them all quarter size on a newspaper, and then we'll cut that newspaper in half, fold it up, put them all together, and we got a book. And we can sell those. We already paid for them. And the first time out, they distributed 250,000 copies. And his boss said, hey, Max, good idea. We'll take it from here, you're fired. So we'll find that this is not an uncommon reaction to comic creators. Here's Max. And so something else that happened in 1933 was that first Superman story that we just looked at from 1938, that was actually written and drawn in 1933 as a comic strip, because comic books didn't exist yet, or they were just about to. They had been shopping it around for 5 years before it had been sold in 1938. And the only reason that it got sold in 1938 was our friend Max Gaines, who they had shopped it over to him a couple of times because he was at his new job, you know. And third time around was the charm. He decided he really kind of liked that story, and he said, you know what? I think you got something. I don't think we can use it, but let me introduce you to this other publisher, DC Comics.
Ooh.
They weren't called DC then, but. And so that's how Max Gaines passed on Superman. People who did do Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, they were thrilled. They were excited to finally, you know, sell this thing after 5 years of shopping it around. A couple other guys, this is Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. They're the ones that created Captain America. So why are these people here? I mean, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster got paid $130 and signed away the rights to Superman. Joe and Jack here, they're having to deal with the same kind of issues too. So why are they here? Well, Jack is a really good example. Jack did pretty much everything in comics over his 60 years in comics. He did just about everything you can do. But when he started, he was known for his action sequences. He really understood, just sort of intrinsically understood how our brains worked and how our brains got excited and just kind of sparked alive again. They really triggered the neurons in your brain, literally, with a scene like this. And he became known for that, and he really enjoyed doing that, but that wasn't why he was doing it. He was doing it for the same kind of reason that most of the other guys were doing it too, which was he had a 3-step plan. His step 1 was go fight a war, because he saw it coming, because this is lead up to World War II. Step 2, come back alive and in one piece, which he did really well. Out of about 1,000 guys that shipped out at the same time as him, 4 came back in one piece. And step 3, start a family. And he found the perfect mate for this in Roz. Roz took care of the family. She took care of all the business end of his work, so he didn't have to ever do anything other than just do the work. And if she had some extra time, she would ink his artwork for him. She had enough talent to do that too. And stepping back to the first part of his plan, in order to go fight a war and have her thrive while he was gone, as soon as Captain America hit and became really popular, he hired a couple other guys to be assistants, and he just started cranking out the Captain America stories and covers. And so while he was overseas, after he got called up, Roz would dutifully turn in the next story every month. And by the time he got back after the war was ended, she had just run out of stories, but she still had a bunch of covers. And it helped with raising 3 kids on a private salary. So back to the 50s and EC comics. And we're going to look at the next trope, which is Mad. Mad comic, which later became Mad Magazine. Mad was making fun of everything, including themselves. Done by Harvey. I'm spacing out Harvey's last name. but the guy that created Mad, the comic awards that are out there now are named after him. But this was one of the first stories they did in Mad Comics. I think this was the 2nd issue, and it was the story Super Duper Man. And Super Duper Man, of course, DC immediately sued them. Now, satire and parody have always been a protected form of speech, free speech. But the judges oftentimes forget that. And what happened was they ended up not, the suit ended up getting dropped, not because, they thought they weren't gonna win it, but DC realized that EC was popular enough that they had just as deep a pocket as DC did, and it would just go on like that until they were both broke. So, coming back around to Wonder Woman, and this is just after William Moulton Marsters, the guy that had created Wonder Woman, and also created the lie detector test, by the way, which is why one reason he was interested in love and truth as her way of working. But, so you get this kind of scene after he dies, and somebody else takes over, that didn't really understand what he was doing with truth, love, and compassion. And so, this is a scene that is almost identical to the scene that I showed you earlier. And she's telling him, as long as crime and evil take no holiday, neither can I. Wait until Amazon ways of peace and love drive brute force and hate out of the world. And he says, heck with you, you're not gonna marry me. And that's completely the opposite of what Wonder Woman had been. And he's not only just getting grumpy, this is after he spent the whole day bugging her, when are we getting married, honey? When are we getting married? While the whole time she's stopping criminals and even swimming across the aisle with the whole boatload of prisoners, and she's dragging the boat with the rope in her mouth, and he's getting upset that she's not responding.
Man.
So, we'll come back around to Wonder Woman. Another thing that was happening here, we're now into the 70s, early 70s, and comic sales have dropped a bit. And the comic creators, they were barred from unionizing, and I don't understand how all that works, but they were a guild, and they were barred from unionizing because of that somehow. And so not only Spider-Man had a problem with getting paid, but here's the Marvel bullpen from this era, and the creators are getting more and more upset because they're really not having a hard time making a living, and they're getting ready to march. They can't do it as a union, but they can individually all happen to march at the same time. And so they're getting ready to do that, and one of the artists for Marvel says, who is a Filipino American, said, well, I know where you can get a bunch of good artists on the cheap. And he's got all his buddies still in the Philippines. Now the Philippines was one of the few countries that still had an interest in comics after the war was over. Most countries, they got comics because the GIs were buying them during the war. And I think it was 25% of all paper matter sold at the PXs during the war were comics. And so they became very, very popular during the war, and when the war ended, And the GIs mostly left. The other countries said, we don't want any more of that. But the Philippines, they had a whole burgeoning industry that had been going since the war. And so everybody, the top guys at Marvel in DC, took a trip over to the Philippines. And they found artists like Alfredo Alcala. Here's Alcala. When they found him, they said, how many pages can you do in a week? And he said, oh, about 40. 40 was a huge number. Jack Kirby was one of the few that could do that. And they said to him, well, no, we're talking, the whole shebang, up from, layout to pencils, inks, lettering, everything. And he said, yeah, about 40. And they said, and they reached in their bag and they pulled out some of the top stuff by their top guys and said, no, this is the level of work we're talking about. And he said, oh, you mean that? 80. He wasn't kidding. He never used assistants, and he was doing stuff like this, 40 pages a week. And so there goes the whole plan for marching. You're just lucky to have a job. Within a few years, 30% of all the artists for Marvel and DC were from the Philippines.
Philippines.
What's that? Okay. So back to the independent or the underground comics, and the underground comics had now sort of set up they kind of figured out their spectrum of the kind of comics that they were doing, and they ranged from adult funny books that were mostly just intended to make you laugh, all the way over to the stuff that was really dealing with all the social issues, and very directly and focused on that. And sometimes you couldn't tell which was which. And that was the spectrum of things. Like the amputee love over here, that sounds like one of their creepy, goofy, kind of weird things. But that was actually a comic written and drawn by two women who were amputees. And it was written about what was essentially the only halfway house in the U.S. for people who were amputees, and it was a pretty raunchy take on it, but it was saying, their way of saying, you can still have your life, and you don't have to, just be done with life just because you've lost a limb. And the nurses at the UCLA hospital who were dealing with all these guys coming back from Vietnam with limbs missing, they immediately ordered 300 copies because there was no other resource out there like this. So along came a guy named Steve Gerber, and Steve was working in mainstream comics, working for Marvel, but he was also he was mostly a satirist, and so he was doing some goofy stuff, and his goofy stuff kind of had half a toe in the underground kind of approach, little cleaner, but still goofy, and he decided he was going to do a story about a duck. It was an angry duck. A duck named Howard.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Howard the Duck. Howard the Duck immediately took off, and his form of satire was something where it became popular regardless of which side of any of the issues he's making fun of you were on. He was able to like make it speak to everybody, and it immediately took off. Immediately he got his own comic, and his own comic strip. There have only been 4 comic characters that Marvel has had who warranted their own comic. It was Spider-Man, the Hulk, Conan the Barbarian, and Howard the Duck. And Steve just was working like crazy now. All this stuff for Howard. And there was even talk of a film getting going. And he said, oh great, I'll start going on that. And they said, oh no, you're not part of that. He's like, that's my character. And they said, oh no, this is our comic. And he was also having some personal issues at the time. He was in the middle of a bad divorce. He was in the middle of moving across country, and his car died halfway there. All these things just kept piling up, and he was getting further and further behind on his deadlines. Until Howard the Duck number 16, he turned in 3 days before it went to press. And nobody had drawn anything yet, he just wrote the script. And the odd thing about it was, it wasn't even a script. It was a series of essays on why he couldn't get it done. And to Marvel's credit, they took his series of essays and walked around the office and said, you're drawing that one, you're drawing that one, you're drawing that one. And they got it out on time. And so the essays were things like doom and despair and trying to find the right road, just trying to read a map, Zen and the art of comic writing and how all that all is affecting him. And just to make sure he included it, part 3, the obligatory fight sequence in comic books. This one with the Vegas showgirl, the ostrich, and of course the deadly shade. And so somewhere along in all of this, Steve realized, wait a minute, I'm not getting paid for all this stuff that I'm doing. I signed a contract. And so he turned around and sued Marvel, and Marvel said, we can't have you working for us if you're suing us, so you're fired. Howard is crazy popular, but as if he had willed it. The Howard the Duck film came out without his input, and is still panned as one of the worst films ever made. And if you were a collector, the first issue of Howard the Duck comics, which was only like 3 years old at this point, it had grown so popular it was worth $100, which, I mean, that's up there with the first issues of, at the time, with the first issues of all kinds of comics. And the film was so bad that overnight they completely lost their value. They were worth face value, more or less. So Steve and Jeff Kirby got together and created Destroyer Duck, the special lawsuit benefit edition. And this was all to pay for his court costs with his battle with Marvel. And they did well enough with this one that they actually kept it going for a while. And this was Steve and Jack Kirby doing most of it, but they also had a whole huge selection of comic creators from all over different publishers that were doing free stuff for this comic. So that, because, you know, they knew what it was like. So back to the, this is the X-Men story that we heard described earlier. And this is when Kitty Pryde does the eulogy. This is the kind of stuff she's saying here. She says, "Who am I? Four-eyed, flat-chested brat, chick, brain, stuck-up Xavier snob freak? Don't like the words? I could use nicer. I've heard worse. Who here hasn't? They're labels, put-downs, and they hurt. If we're lucky, we have someone to turn to." And this is the kind of thing that the comics are doing. You'll notice that this is in reprints, changing social mores. It meant that they didn't even list the words that she's talking about. So the guy that described it for us before is named Nate Powell, and he's a graphic novelist. He did March, which you may have heard of. It's the autobiography of John Lewis. And he's won National Book Award twice with that. He's going to tell us how reading that comic that we just looked at affect his life.
I'd say like the single issue that nailed it all home was this New Mutants issue number 45. I mean, there's no action in this entire issue. It's all conversational, which blew my mind as a 12-year-old. And I remember when I read it, being so shaken by it as a 7th grader, just like walking in my dramatic way, and my parents like around the kitchen table just hanging out, and I read her eulogy, and I believe I just like walked up. Yeah, like they remember that moment very clearly, and for them, that was one of those moments where they said to each other, like, "Oh, I guess there's more to these comics than we thought." We didn't know that comics could even talk about stuff like that. Like, this is one of the handful of things in comics that changed the course of my life.
So really what's happening with this is that it's not only creating an urgency to activism, it's also creating activist artists, and a whole new generation of activist artists here popped up as a result of all of that. Here's Kurt Swan, coming back around to the issue of being paid fair wage. Kurt Swan is the only person who has drawn more comic pages than Jack Kirby. And he did it because he was sort of the opposite of Kirby. Where Kirby did everything, Kurt Swan did one thing. He was the one who created the defining image of Superman. Everybody that got hired after him was hired and told, draw like Kurt Swan. And he did that for 35 years. And then one day, when he was in the middle of finishing up his latest issue, they said, "Oh, by the way, Kurt, when you're done with that one, we're done. We don't need you anymore." All comic creators are freelance. That's the way the industry works. So there's there's no, stopping drawing comics when you get older.
Jeff,
So-
excuse me, we could probably use a break in a little bit. Is there a natural break
There is,
point?
we're just about to.
Okay, great.
Yes.
All right.
Um, Yeah, so, you know, no fanfare or anything, they just were done with Kurt. I think he did like a handful of stories that were retro stories. But that was it. And to talk to, when I say they had a hard time getting paid, like a reasonable rate, you can see basically what this chart is telling you. Most comic creators are paid by the page, so they have a page rate. That page rate, when comic books first started, took about a decade to kind of settle on a regular price. And it is still the same price. With not adjusted for inflation, you get between $100 and $150 per page. And that's the same amount that basically, with illustrators at large, have gotten that rate since the Great Depression.
Jeez.
Here's Nate Powell's version of it, and it's because he's doing a full book each time as opposed to individual issues. And basically what this all tells you is, is that he's still getting a page rate of about $110, $125. And he's won the National Book Award twice. He's the only comic creator to have won the National Book Award. And yeah, you're getting $450 a month. So you're working on multiple books at the same time. Anyway. So that begs the question, with Jack Kirby, who created so much in his 60 years of doing comics, and he created all of these characters. He created something like half the Marvel universe. What is the individual comic the one issue that made more money for him than any other comic that he ever did? If anybody wants to take a guess at what that comic was, go right ahead, you'll be wrong. But to answer that, we've got to go back one more time, and we'll do that in a minute.
Okay.
Thanks.